For years, his own family called him worthless, a failure who couldn't hold a job, the mistake they tolerated at Sunday dinners out of pity. They mocked him in private, excluded him from business meetings, erased him from family photos displayed in the estate's grand hallways. What they didn't know, what they couldn't possibly imagine as they laughed behind his back and made decisions about the empire they believed was theirs, was that he controlled every single dollar, every property deed, every stock certificate, every clause in the trust that determined their futures. He sat quietly at the edge of the table, eating in silence while they planned his irrelevance, and not one of them suspected that the man they dismissed as useless was the only person their father had trusted with the truth. Before we dive into this story, leave a comment below. Have you ever witnessed a family destroy their own heir? And if you want to follow real stories of power, money, family betrayals, and forbidden inheritances, subscribe to the channel right now. Turn up the volume. Pay attention to every detail, because this story reveals what the wealthiest families hide behind closed doors. Florida, 1972. The Hargrove estate sat on 47 acres of prime waterfront property in Palm Beach, a sprawling compound of white columns, manicured lawns, tennis courts, and a private dock where 3 yachts rocked gently in the Atlantic breeze. The family had built their fortune in shipping during the war, expanded into real estate in the 50s, and by the early 70s controlled a portfolio worth an estimated $38 million, equivalent to over $250 million today. The patriarch, Clayton Hargrove, was 71 years old, a man whose word could move markets, whose phone calls could end political careers, whose approval meant everything to the 4 children who circled him like planets around a dying star. There was Margaret, the eldest, 46, married to a federal judge, polished and calculating, the family's public face. Then Victor, 43, who ran the shipping division with an iron fist and a taste for expensive cars and younger women. Catherine, 39, the society darling, her name in every charity gala program, her face in every Palm Beach magazine. And then there was Daniel, 35, the youngest, the one they never mentioned in interviews, the one whose name appeared on no corporate documents, the one who lived in the guest house behind the main estate, the one they called Danny, always Danny, never Daniel. As if even his full name carried too much weight for what he was, Daniel had never fit the family mold. While his siblings attended boarding schools in Switzerland and universities in the Ivy League, Daniel had struggled through local colleges, changing majors 3 times, finally graduating with a degree in literature that made his father sigh with disappointment at the dinner table. While Victor closed shipping deals and Margaret networked with senators, Daniel worked briefly as a teacher, then tried his hand at writing, publishing nothing, earning nothing, drifting through his 20s and early 30s in a fog of failed attempts and quiet withdrawal. The family tolerated him because blood demanded it, but they made sure he knew his place. At board meetings, he wasn't invited to attend. They joked about Danny's poetry phase, Danny's teaching disaster, Danny's complete inability to understand money. Margaret would smile tightly when relatives asked about her youngest brother and say he was finding himself, which everyone understood meant he was unemployed and unemployable. Victor told business partners that the family had 3 children who mattered and 1 who didn't, and nobody corrected him. Catherine simply pretended Daniel didn't exist, walking past him at family gatherings without acknowledgement, her eyes sliding over him as if he were part of the furniture, decorative and irrelevant. What made Daniel's position even more humiliating was how visible his failure became after his divorce in 1969. He had married young, a brief union to a woman named Laura, who left him after 2 years, citing his lack of ambition, his emotional distance, his inability to provide the life she'd expected when she married into the Hargrove name. The divorce was quiet but devastating, and Daniel moved into the guest house shortly after, a small two-bedroom cottage that had once housed the estate manager, now his permanent residence. A daily reminder that he lived on family property because he couldn't afford to live anywhere else. His siblings made sure everyone knew. At a charity dinner in 1970, Margaret introduced her brothers and sister to a group of donors, gesturing toward Victor's accomplishments, Catherine's philanthropic work, and when someone asked about Daniel, who stood awkwardly near the bar, Margaret said, "He's staying with us right now." The phrasing so deliberate, so carefully chosen to communicate dependence and failure, that Daniel felt the weight of every eye in the room turning toward him, with pity or contempt. The family's treatment of Daniel intensified after Clayton's first heart attack in early 1971. The patriarch survived, but the event triggered something in his children, an awareness of mortality, a recognition that the empire would soon change hands. And with that recognition came a cold calculation about who deserved what. Margaret began hosting private dinners at her home, gatherings that included Victor and Catherine, but never Daniel. Meetings where they discussed the estate, the business, the future, speaking in careful language about preserving what father built and ensuring the right people maintained control. Victor started making comments at Sunday dinners about how the business required serious people, people who understood sacrifice and risk, people who had proven themselves. His eyes never quite landing on Daniel, but the message unmistakable. Catherine convinced their father to update his will, suggesting it was simply good planning, practical estate management, nothing more. And Clayton agreed, meeting with his lawyers throughout 1971. Document after document arriving at the estate in sealed envelopes that Victor would collect personally from the study. Daniel watched all of this happen with the quiet resignation of someone who had learned not to fight battles he couldn't win. He attended the Sunday dinners because his father insisted, sitting at the far end of the long mahogany table while his siblings discussed business, politics, investments, speaking a language of power and money that felt foreign to him, their laughter sharp and exclusionary. He lived in the guest house and tried to ignore the fact that his siblings called it Danny's cottage in conversations, diminishing even his living space to something childish and temporary. He watched Victor arrive in a new Mercedes, Margaret appear in designer clothes fresh from Paris, Catherine drip with jewelry worth more than most people's homes, and he wore the same 3 suits he'd owned for years, the same worn shoes, the same quiet invisibility that let him move through the estate like a ghost. When relatives visited for holidays, they would ask Clayton how the children were doing, and he would talk about Margaret's political connections, Victor's business expansion, Catherine's social influence, and then pause, his face clouding slightly, before saying, "And Daniel is here." The phrasing so empty of achievement or pride that it hurt more than any insult. The cruelty reached its peak in the summer of 1972, 6 months before Clayton's death. The family gathered for a 4th of July celebration, the estate filled with guests, politicians, business magnates, society figures, everyone who mattered in Florida power circles. Victor gave a speech on the lawn, talking about the family legacy, about carrying forward his father's vision, about the responsibility that came with the Hargrove name. He thanked Margaret for her guidance, Catherine for her grace, and he never mentioned Daniel, not once, even though Daniel stood 20 feet away holding a glass of champagne he hadn't touched, visible to everyone, present but erased. Later that evening, Daniel overheard his siblings talking in the study, the door slightly ajar, their voices low but clear. Margaret was saying they needed to have a conversation with father about the guest house, about how long Danny could reasonably stay there, about whether it was healthy for him to remain so dependent. Victor agreed, suggesting they could help him find an apartment somewhere, something small, affordable, maybe in Fort Lauderdale, where he wouldn't be so visible. Catherine laughed, a cold sound, and said she'd already looked into it. There were some options near the community college, places that would suit his lifestyle. They were discussing his future, his home, his existence, as if he were a problem to be managed, a burden to be shifted. And not one of them considered that he might hear, that he might feel, that it might matter. Daniel returned to the guest house that night and sat in the dark for hours, staring at nothing, feeling the weight of 35 years of being less than, of being other, of being the mistake his family couldn't quite erase but desperately wanted to minimize. He thought about leaving, about disappearing entirely, about sparing them the embarrassment of his continued existence in their orbit. He thought about his father, who had been kind in distant ways, who had never openly mocked him like his siblings, but who had also never defended him, never insisted they treat him with respect, never used his considerable power to demand better. And he thought about the envelope his father had given him 3 years earlier, in 1969, shortly after the divorce. A sealed package with instructions written in Clayton's careful handwriting: "Open only after my death. Discuss with no one. Trust no one." Daniel had placed it in a safe deposit box at a bank in West Palm Beach, had followed his father's instructions exactly, had never mentioned it to anyone, had almost forgotten about it in the years of humiliation that followed. If this story is already making you uncomfortable, hit the like button now to support the channel. And in the comments, tell us, do you think the family knew everything from the beginning, or were they caught completely off guard? Subscribe so you don't miss other real stories of inheritances, family secrets, and the silent falls of empires. Now keep watching, because what comes next changes everything. Clayton Hargrove died on December 14, 1972, at 7:43 in the morning, a massive heart attack that killed him before the ambulance arrived. The family gathered at the estate within hours, grief mixed with the cold practicality of wealth, phone calls to lawyers and accountants and bankers, arrangements for a funeral that would be attended by governors and senators and corporate titans. Margaret took charge immediately, organizing everything with the efficiency of someone who had been preparing for this moment. Her voice steady as she directed staff, confirmed guest lists, approved the obituary that would run in every major newspaper. Victor handled the business side, in calling the shipping office, the real estate managers, the investment advisors, making sure everyone understood that leadership was secure, that the empire would continue without interruption. Catherine managed the social elements, contacting the right people, ensuring the funeral would reflect the family's status, that every detail would communicate power and permanence. And Daniel sat in the guest house, staring at the wall, feeling nothing and everything, grief for a father who had never quite been a father, relief that the performance was over, dread for what came next. The funeral took place 3 days later at the Episcopal Church in Palm Beach, a service attended by over 500 people, the pews filled with influence and money. The eulogies delivered by men who spoke of Clayton's vision, his integrity, his legacy. Margaret spoke about her father's dedication to family, her voice breaking perfectly on cue. Victor praised his father's business acumen, his ability to see opportunities others missed. Catherine shared memories of his generosity, his love for his children and grandchildren. Daniel was not asked to speak. He sat in the third row, behind his siblings and their families, wearing the same dark suit he'd worn to his wedding, his divorce hearing, every formal event for the past decade. And nobody turned to look at him. Nobody acknowledged his presence. Nobody seemed to register that the youngest child existed at all. At the reception afterward, held at the estate, Daniel stood near the windows overlooking the ocean, while hundreds of guests offered condolences to Margaret, Victor, and Catherine, the 3 Hargrove children, the inheritors of the empire, the future of the family name. An elderly business associate approached Daniel at one point and asked if he was family, and Daniel said, "Yes, I'm his son," and the man looked confused, glanced around as if trying to place him in the hierarchy, and then nodded politely before walking away, the interaction so perfectly encapsulating Daniel's position that he almost laughed. The will reading was scheduled for December 22, 1972, 8 days after the funeral, in the study of the Palm Beach estate. The family gathered at 10 in the morning, Margaret, Victor, and Catherine arriving together in Victor's Mercedes, dressed in expensive black, their faces composed in expressions of solemn expectation. Daniel drove himself in a 10-year-old Chevrolet that barely started, parking near the guest house and walking across the lawn to the main house, entering through the side door as he always did, as he'd been taught to do, the servant's entrance. The invisible path. The lawyer, Bernard Whitmore, had been the family's attorney for 30 years, a precise man in his 60s who had drafted every major document Clayton had ever signed. He sat at the head of the mahogany table in the study, the same table where Daniel had eaten silent dinners for years, and he arranged his papers with deliberate care, his expression unreadable. Margaret sat to his right, Victor beside her, Catherine next to Victor, the power structure visible in their positioning, their proximity to authority, their assumption of belonging. Daniel sat at the far end of the table, the same seat he'd occupied at every family meal, the seat from which he'd watched his siblings plan his irrelevance. Whitmore began with the standard language, the legal formalities, the technical terminology that meant Clayton Hargrove had been of sound mind and clear intention when he'd drafted his last will and testament. He read through the smaller bequests first, donations to charities, gifts to long-time employees, a trust for the grandchildren's education. Margaret nodded along, her hand resting on Victor's arm, both of them relaxed, confident, already mentally dividing what they assumed was theirs. Catherine examined her nails, bored, waiting for the real business to begin. Then Whitmore paused, looked up from the document, his eyes moving across the three eldest children before settling on Daniel at the far end of the table. "What I'm about to read," he said carefully, "was drafted by Clayton in 1969, updated twice in 1971, and finalized in September of this year. He was absolutely clear about his intentions. He made me repeat his instructions back to him on 3 separate occasions to ensure I understood exactly what he wanted." Margaret's expression shifted slightly, a tiny furrow appearing between her eyebrows. Victor leaned forward, suddenly attentive. Catherine stopped examining her nails. Whitmore continued, his voice steady and professional, reading words that would dismantle everything they believed they knew. "To my eldest daughter, Margaret, Clayton's will stated, I leave the house in Georgetown, the property in Aspen, and a trust fund of $500,000 to be distributed over 10 years in recognition of her public service and her family's needs." Margaret's face went white. $500,000. The Georgetown house was valuable but mortgaged. The Aspen property was a 2-bedroom condo. This was not an inheritance. This was an allowance, a pension, an afterthought. "To my son Victor," the will continued, "I leave the commercial property in Miami, the warehouse complex in Fort Lauderdale, and a trust fund of $750,000 to be distributed over 10 years in recognition of his work in the family business." Victor made a sound, something between a cough and a gasp. The properties Whitmore mentioned were valuable, but they were also leveraged, carrying debt, requiring management. This was not the shipping empire, not the controlling stake in the company, not the inheritance of power he'd spent 20 years expecting. "To my daughter Catherine, I leave the apartment in Manhattan, the art collection currently held in storage, and a trust fund of $500,000 to be distributed over 10 years in recognition of her social contributions to the family name." Catherine's mouth opened slightly, closed, opened again. The Manhattan apartment was a 1-bedroom in a decent building, nothing spectacular. The art collection was moderately valuable, but would need to be sold, liquidated, converted to actual money. This was not the life she'd imagined, not the wealth she'd assumed was hers by birthright. Whitmore let the silence stretch, watching the three eldest children process what they'd just heard before he continued reading. The Palm Beach estate, all 47 acres including the main house, guest house, and dock facilities, is left to my son Daniel, along with full ownership of Hargrove Shipping Enterprises, Hargrove Real Estate Holdings, Hargrove Investment Trust, and all associated corporate entities, accounts, properties and assets. With the exception of those specifically bequeathed above, Daniel is named executor of this estate, trustee of all family trusts, and sole voting shareholder of all family business interests. My other children will receive the distributions outlined above and nothing more. The room went completely silent, the kind of silence that feels physical, that presses against your eardrums like deep water. Daniel sat frozen at the end of the table, his hands gripping the armrests of his chair, his mind trying to process what he'd just heard. The words not quite connecting to reality, not quite making sense, despite their perfect clarity. Margaret stood abruptly, her chair scraping against the hardwood floor, her face flushed with sudden rage. "This is a mistake," she said, her voice shaking. "This is impossible. Father would never." Victor cut her off, turning to Whitmore with the command he'd used his entire adult life, the tone that had closed deals and intimidated competitors. "This will is invalid," he said flatly. "It's clearly the product of undue influence, manipulation, possibly dementia. My father was not in his right mind. We'll contest this immediately." Catherine just stared at Daniel, her eyes wide with something that looked like horror, like she was seeing him for the first time, like the invisible ghost at the end of the table had suddenly materialized into something real and terrifying. Whitmore raised one hand, his expression unchanged, unmoved by their shock or anger or disbelief. "The will is entirely valid," he said calmly. Clayton was evaluated by 2 independent physicians in September, both of whom confirmed his mental competency. He drafted this will personally in my presence and signed it in front of 3 witnesses, none of whom have any connection to Daniel or any interest in the estate. He anticipated you might contest it, which is why he left detailed instructions, recorded statements, and documentation of his reasoning, all of which I'm prepared to present in court if necessary. Margaret's hands were shaking. "This is obscene," she said, her voice rising. "Daniel has done nothing, contributed nothing, earned nothing. We ran the business. We maintained the family reputation. We sacrificed everything while he sat in that guest house doing absolutely nothing. And you're telling me that father gave him everything? That Danny, useless Danny, who couldn't hold a job or a marriage, who has lived off our charity for years, owns everything we built?" Whitmore opened another folder, removing a sealed envelope, and slid it across the table toward Daniel. "Your father left this for you," he said quietly. "He asked that you read it now in front of your siblings." Daniel's hands trembled as he picked up the envelope, Clayton's handwriting on the front, the same careful script from the envelope he'd received in 1969, the envelope currently sitting in a safe deposit box at a West Palm Beach bank. He opened it slowly, unfolded the single page inside, and began to read his father's words, written months before his death. The truth finally spoken after decades of silence. "Daniel," the letter began, "if you're reading this, I'm gone, and your siblings are probably in shock, possibly in rage, certainly demanding explanations. Here is the truth I never told them, the truth I protected you from until this moment. You are my only biological child." The words seemed to echo in the silent study, impossible and absolute. Daniel's vision blurred, his hands gripping the paper so tightly it crumpled at the edges. "Your mother," the letter continued, "had affairs throughout our marriage. something I discovered accidentally in 1965 through a private investigator I'd hired for unrelated business reasons. The investigation revealed that Margaret, Victor, and Catherine are not my biological children, a fact I confirmed through discreet DNA testing in 1966. I never confronted your mother because the scandal would have destroyed everything we'd built, the family name, the business relationships, the social position that took decades to establish. I chose to protect the family publicly while privately ensuring the empire I built with my own hands, my own work, my own sacrifice, went to my only actual heir, you. The one person I know carries my blood, my genes, my legitimate claim to everything I've created. Daniel looked up from the letter, his eyes meeting Margaret's, then Victor's, then Catherine's, seeing their faces shift from shock to something darker, more fundamental, a cracking of identity that went deeper than money or power. Victor was shaking his head slowly, his mouth working silently, his entire sense of self visibly collapsing. Catherine had tears running down her face, her expression not sad but destroyed, annihilated by the casual revelation that her entire life had been built on a lie. Margaret just stared at Daniel with pure hatred, the kind of hatred that comes from humiliation so complete it burns through every other emotion. The letter continued, Clayton's careful words explaining why he'd let Daniel suffer, why he'd allowed the years of mockery and exclusion and deliberate erasure. I let them treat you as less than because I needed to see who they truly were, the letter stated. I needed to know if they would show compassion, integrity, character when they believed they had all the power and you had none. They failed that test spectacularly. They proved themselves to be cruel, calculating, and unworthy of leading anything I built. You, on the other hand, endured with quiet dignity, never once retaliating, never once becoming like them despite every reason to do so. That is why you inherit everything, because you earned it by being the only decent human being in this family. The letter concluded with practical instructions, account numbers, names of trusted advisors, a list of lawyers who could help Daniel navigate what would certainly be legal challenges from his siblings. Clayton's final words were simple and devastating. They will tell you I was senile, manipulated, incompetent. Don't believe them. I have never been more clear-headed than I was when I drafted this will. You are my son. You are my heir. You are my legacy. Everything else is just noise. The signature at the bottom was steady and clear. No tremor, no hesitation. The handwriting of a man who knew exactly what he was doing and why. Daniel set the letter down on the table, his hands still shaking. His mind racing through 35 years of humiliation and silence, every mocking comment, every exclusion, every moment of being treated as worthless, all of it suddenly recontextualized, reframed, transformed from his failure into their test. A test they'd failed so completely, so thoroughly, that his father had chosen to burn their lives down rather than reward their cruelty. Margaret moved first, lunging toward the letter, trying to grab it, but Whitmore was faster, collecting it and the will and placing both in his briefcase. "Those are legal documents," he said coldly. "They remain in my custody." Margaret's face was twisted with rage and desperation. "We'll fight this," she said, her voice breaking. "We'll contest it. We'll challenge the DNA claims. We'll prove father was incompetent. We'll drag this through court for years if we have to. Daniel will never see $1 of this money." Victor stood as well, his face red, his fists clenched. "You're nothing," he said to Daniel, his voice shaking with fury. "You've always been nothing. Father was clearly manipulated, probably by you, probably with help from whoever he was sleeping with after mother died. This is fraud. This is elder abuse. This is theft. And we will prove it." Catherine just kept crying, her sobs getting louder, her hands covering her face, her entire identity shattered by the revelation that she wasn't a Hargrove at all, that her name, her status, Her entire life had been a performance built on her mother's affair. Daniel stood slowly, pushing his chair back, feeling something shift inside him. Some fundamental change in how he saw himself and these people who had tortured him for decades. "I'm not fighting you," he said quietly, his voice steady despite the chaos inside his chest. Father left instructions with Whitmore, evidence with multiple lawyers, documentation that will hold up in any court you want to drag this to. You can spend the next 10 years trying to break this will, and you'll lose, and you'll waste whatever money you did inherit on legal fees, and you'll destroy whatever reputation you have left when the truth about Mother comes out in discovery. Or you can accept what Father decided and move on with your lives. The choice is yours. Margaret's laugh was bitter and sharp. "Move on?" she spat. "Move on to what? You're taking everything we worked for, everything we built." Victor cut in, his voice venomous. "You didn't build anything," Daniel said, the words landing like physical blows. "You managed what Father created. You used what he gave you. But you didn't build it, you didn't sacrifice for it, and according to Father, you didn't even deserve it. That's not my decision. That's his. Take it up with his grave." The lawsuits began within a week. 3 separate challenges to the will filed by 3 separate law firms. Claims of mental incompetence, undue influence, fraud, and breach of fiduciary duty. The legal battle that Margaret had promised stretched across 1973 and into 1974. Depositions and hearings and motions, every piece of Clayton's business and personal life examined under legal microscopes, searching for any crack, any inconsistency, any proof that the will was invalid. But Clayton had been meticulous, had anticipated everything, had left documentation so thorough and clear that every challenge fell apart under scrutiny. The physician's evaluations showed perfect mental competency. The witnesses to the will's signing were unimpeachable, including a retired judge and a law professor. And when Victor's lawyers pushed for DNA testing to challenge Clayton's claims about paternity, Whitmore produced sealed results from a laboratory in Switzerland, dated 1966, showing definitively that Margaret, Victor, and Catherine shared no genetic material with Clayton Hargrove, while Daniel's match was absolute and undeniable. The truth came out in stages, leaked through legal documents, whispered in society circles, reported eventually in careful language by newspapers that understood the implications. Clayton Hargrove had disinherited 3 of his 4 children because they weren't actually his children, because his wife had been unfaithful for decades, because he'd chosen to protect his only biological son and punish the cruelty of the others. The scandal destroyed what remained of Margaret's political connections, her husband, the judge, quietly requesting a transfer to a different circuit to escape the attention. Victor's position in the business became untenable once it became public that he had no actual ownership, and he resigned in early 1974, taking a position with a competitor for a fraction of his former salary. Catherine withdrew from society entirely, her name disappearing from charity boards and gala committees, her friends evaporating once the Hargrove money and name no longer meant what they once had. Daniel took control of the empire in February 1973, formally assuming his father's positions, his titles, his authority. He moved into the main house and converted the guest house into an office for the estate manager. He restructured the shipping business, modernized the real estate holdings, and expanded the investment portfolio with a caution and intelligence that surprised the advisors who'd spent years listening to Victor's aggressive strategies. He proved himself competent, careful, and far more capable than anyone, including possibly himself, had expected. The employees who'd watched him be humiliated at family gatherings for years now reported to him, and he treated them with respect and fairness, never mentioning the past, never seeking revenge or recognition, simply doing the work his father had entrusted to him. The business thrived under his leadership. Growing steadily through the 70s and 80s, avoiding the flashy risks Victor had favored, building something sustainable and solid. Margaret, Victor, and Catherine never reconciled with Daniel, never apologized, never acknowledged their cruelty or their years of making him feel worthless. They took their inheritances, smaller than they'd expected, but still substantial by any normal measure, and they built separate lives as far from Palm Beach as they could manage. Margaret moved to Colorado, Victor to Texas, Catherine to California, all of them choosing distance over confrontation, absence over accountability. They told their own children different versions of the story, carefully edited narratives where they were the victims of a manipulative brother and a senile father, where the lost inheritance was theft rather than consequence. And perhaps they believed those versions. Perhaps they needed to believe them to survive the destruction of everything they'd built their identities on. The revelation that they were not Hargroves at all, that they'd been living someone else's story their entire lives. Daniel married again in 1979, a quiet ceremony to a woman named Sarah who taught literature at a local college. Someone who knew nothing about the Hargrove name or the inheritance or the scandal. Someone who fell in love with the quiet. Thoughtful man who volunteered at the library and donated to literacy programs and seemed incapable of arrogance despite his wealth. They had 2 children, raised them away from the toxicity Daniel had grown up in, taught them that money was a tool and not an identity, that character mattered more than status. That family was something you built through love and not something you inherited through blood. He never spoke to his children about Margaret, Victor, or Catherine, never mentioned the years of humiliation or the shock of the will reading or the legal battles that followed. When they asked about his childhood, he said it was complicated and moved on, refusing to pass down the poison his siblings had tried to force him to drink. The Hargrove estate still stands today, though Daniel sold most of the land in the 90s, keeping only the main house and 5 acres, converting the rest to conservation land that would never be developed. The shipping business was sold in the 80s to a larger corporation. The real estate holdings gradually liquidated. The investment trust restructured into foundations supporting education, literacy, and family services. Daniel lived until 2011, dying at 74 of natural causes, surrounded by his wife and children and grandchildren, leaving behind a legacy that had nothing to do with the empire his father built and everything to do with the life he'd chosen to live after being given a second chance. His siblings outlived him, Margaret dying in 2015, Victor in 2018, Catherine still alive as of this writing, all of them having lived comfortable but diminished lives. The Hargrove name attached to them like a ghost of something they'd never actually been entitled to claim. Stories like this reveal that money doesn't just expose character, it detonates the lies families build over generations, the carefully maintained fictions about blood and belonging and who deserves what. The Hargrove case is extreme in its revelation. In the DNA bombshell that transformed a standard inheritance dispute into an existential crisis for 3 people who'd spent their lives believing they were something they weren't. But strip away that specific detail, and you're left with a more universal truth about power, cruelty, and consequence. The 3 eldest Hargrove children destroyed Daniel not because he deserved it, but because they could. Because in families built on hierarchy and control, someone always needs to be at the bottom to make everyone else feel secure at the top. They made him the family scapegoat, the acceptable target for mockery and exclusion, and they felt justified doing it because he didn't perform success the way they did, didn't speak their language of deals and status and social maneuvering. What they never considered was that their father was watching, judging, keeping score, and that the performance they thought they were giving for him was actually revealing exactly what he didn't want to reward. Clayton Hargrove's decision to disinherit his non-biological children while letting them believe they were heirs for years raises uncomfortable questions about manipulation, control, and the ethics of testing people without their knowledge. He subjected Daniel to decades of humiliation as a social experiment, watching his son suffer to determine if the others would show basic human decency. And when they failed that test, he punished them catastrophically. There's something cruel in that approach, something that suggests Clayton himself was not a victim in this family's dysfunction, but a participant, an architect of the pain he claimed to be correcting. He could have stopped the mockery at any time, could have insisted his other children treat Daniel with respect, could have been the father Daniel needed instead of the silent observer who let abuse continue for the sake of gathering evidence. Instead, he chose to let the dysfunction play out, to let his son be destroyed, and then to use that destruction as justification for his ultimate decision, as if Daniel's suffering was a necessary component of the moral lesson Clayton wanted to teach. The deeper lesson isn't about who deserved the inheritance, it's about what families do to the people they decide don't matter. The casual cruelty that becomes acceptable when someone falls outside the circle of approval and achievement. Margaret, Victor, and Catherine weren't monsters, they were successful, socially prominent people who failed the most basic test of character when they thought nobody was judging them for it. They treated their brother as worthless because he didn't contribute to their status, didn't enhance their position, didn't reflect well on the family brand they'd worked so hard to maintain. And in doing so, they revealed exactly the kind of people Clayton didn't want controlling his legacy. People who measured human value by utility, by contribution to their own comfort and success, by performance in a system they'd designed to exclude anyone who didn't play by their rules. The inheritance was never really about money. It was about Clayton's final statement on what his empire actually meant, who it was actually for, and what he thought of the children who'd proven themselves willing to torture a family member for the crime of being different. Daniel's story after the inheritance is almost more important than the dramatic revelation that preceded it. He could have become vindictive, could have used his power to punish his siblings further, could have spent decades seeking revenge for the humiliation they'd inflicted. Instead, he built something quiet and decent, used the wealth to create stability for his own family and support causes he believed in, and walked away from the drama as quickly as possible. He understood something his siblings never did. That inheritance wasn't about what you received, it was about what you did with it afterward, how you carried the weight of sudden wealth and unexpected power. Whether you became the kind of person the money revealed or the kind of person you chose to be despite it. The fact that he sold most of the empire, converted the land to conservation, and lived a relatively modest life suggests he learned the lesson his father never managed to teach his other children, that wealth is temporary, status is performance, and the only thing that survives you is how you treated people when you had the power to hurt them and chose not to. If this story shocked you, hit the like button, share it, and write your thoughts in the comments. Explore the channel for more real stories of inheritances, powerful families, and social taboos that should have stayed buried. Subscribe and turn on notifications, because some truths only emerge when money changes hands, and the stories that follow are the ones nobody wants told.